Why is Africa so poor? It is not poverty that needs an explanation. For most of human history, misery is what prevailed for the vast majority of people in the vast majority of places. Africa simply has many issues, and these issues can be traced throughout Africa's history. For starters, Africa has always had a problem with agriculture. For the vast majority of African history, agriculture was inefficient. There were no draft animals to help in the cultivation of large fields because everything was done by hand. Secondly, African people did not and do not have any tradition of long-distance navigation. Thirdly, for many years, African armies were always stronger than that of the Europeans through their fierce warrior cultures. But by the time Europe became strong enough to conquer, Africa's large empires were either technologically in a disadvantage or had gone in decline. Fourthly, before the Europeans embarked on the colonization of Africa, Africa had very few roads that would have enabled long-distance commerce. In this regard, by the 19th century, there was nothing that the Africans could do to stop the Europeans from colonizing them. The military power of the invaders and the ability to project it anywhere in the world was unparalleled. With these handicaps, it was no surprise that in spite of the valiant efforts of some African leaders like Samori Touré, the continent was inexorably conquered. After the colonization era, Africans were beset by a number of problems, the first of which was a high quantity of low levels of literacy. This meant that African states remained reliant on their former colonizers to maintain the administrative apparatus. Secondly, Africa only had a very short period of democratic tutelage, meaning there was no tradition of an independent judiciary and no middle class jealous of ancient rights to be protected. The structure of these states easily lent itself to democratic backsliding. Thirdly, the common enemy, the colonizer, was gone, which meant that the inter-ethnic strife that had been suppressed for the purpose of fighting for independence reasserted itself very quickly afterwards. Fourthly, most African states were not economically viable. A number of them were landlocked and depended on the goodwill of their neighbors for their exports. There was no industry, there was a lack of teachers, and there were very few physicians. Fifthly, the only infrastructure present was built by the colonizers, as everything was directed towards extracting resources or agricultural products and exporting them to the former masters. It was easier to place a phone call from Dakar to Paris than from Dakar to Cape Town. And lastly, the former colonizers were jealous of Africans' prerogatives, as the Europeans wanted to maintain monopolies on local contracts. It can also be noted that the West were also obsessed with the possibility of witnessing the spread of communism in Africa. In order to stave this off, they routinely took to meddling in the internal affairs of official independent states. Colonization made future development difficult in Africa, as African regions had been exceedingly poor before colonization. Let's not forget that Africa's natural resources had been ruthlessly exploited. In the present day, we can say without a shadow of a doubt that there are definitely some actions taken by the West that is contributing to the impoverishment of African countries. An example of this can be the implementation of unfair trade practices, as Western governments subsidize their farmers, who can thereby produce foodstuffs cheaper than local African farmers, who are driven out of business when the cheaper stuff comes pouring in. Secondly, the structure of foreign aid is terrible. And thirdly, structural adjustment programs, which are austerity packages imposed by the IMF and the World Bank on many African nations in the wake of recessions. So, let me summarize. Africa is poor because, firstly, it was undeveloped before colonization due to a combination of inefficient agriculture, poor transportation infrastructure, and lack of political stability. Secondly, colonization led to exploitation. Thirdly, decolonization led to instability and inter-ethnic strife. Fourthly, the regimes that were established after independence were exceedingly corrupt and badly mismanaged their economies. And lastly, Western influence has often had negative consequences, either by supporting rebellions or by imposing doctrinaire free marketism.